Okay, Glenn, we have some questions for you from our Ask Me Anything
Excellent.
today. So here we go. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Perfect. Question number 1. I recently read about Brental Bonnie Bent McPherson's visitation in the news, where his body was seated behind a drum kit. What is the most unique visitation or funeral you were involved in?
I could keep you all day with a question like this because I've just had so many. One of the ones I think I would like to reflect on would be one time I made funeral arrangements with a family, and the fellow was a bit of a carpenter, and they were selecting the casket, and they seemed to keep being drawn back to the cremation section even though he was going to be buried, because there was that sort of quote unquote pine box. And but you know, that's typically used for immediate cremation. It's not necessarily perfect for visitation. So they selected a casket, and later that evening they called me and they're like, we are really stuck on this pine box, and you know, is it something we can do? So I said, of course, we can make anything work. So I slept on it that night, and when I woke up I thought, well, if he was a carpenter and he could probably build his own pine box, and we're going to use this, then let's make it worthwhile. So what we did was we set him up in the pine box, and instead of putting him on that traditional casket carriage, or as we call it, a bier, we set the casket up on sawhorses. And then we brought a workbench into the visiting room, and we spread tools all around it, and we shaved wood, and we spread that all around the carpet, you know, around the tool bench and what have you. So that you know, created a very unique environment for the family to really embrace their loved one's profession and hobby as a woodworker. So I think that would be one of the best ones. There's no end to personalizing a funeral in any manner.
Question number 2. We hear about green or natural burials a lot these days. Is there such a thing as a green funeral? And if so, what is it?
Well, a green funeral is when you take a little bit more of an environmentally friendly approach to the funeral service process. There's a lot of people who are concerned about the materials that a casket is built from being buried. Sometimes burial vaults are used in cemeteries, and people worry about the leaching from cement. And of course, the largest concern for people is the leaching of embalming fluids and what have you from the body into the earth. So the thought is to create a more environmentally friendly, perhaps where maybe the decedent isn't embalmed at all, and wrapped in something that's a little more natural, like raw, undyed cottons, and buried in a cemetery that's designated as a green cemetery, where no casket that has any type of finish can be used. So oftentimes a basket casket is used, or in some cemeteries they'll even allow the deceased to be lowered on a natural piece of wood, not manufactured, just wrapped in a cotton or a burlap shroud, and then buried in that regard. So most definitely it's a well talked about funeral process, and most any funeral home is prepared to help any family through those goals as well.
Due to COVID, funerals and graveside services are live streamed for family members that cannot attend in person. Will this service continue to be offered in the future, even when we return to normal, whatever normal will be?
That's a great question, and it's really been an interesting year and a half so far since the onset of COVID. You know, prior to COVID, some funeral homes were streaming funerals, which was, you know, really state of the art. But COVID has brought in a real priority to being able to stream funerals. It really is an opportunity to allow people who can't attend due to distance. We've been able to provide funeral services, and people have been able to join from all around the world using this technology. So the world becomes a very small place when we can use the technology that we have right now, such as the internet, to stream funerals. So I don't see this going away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, we've actually hardwired the equipment into our funeral home with mounted cameras and speakers. So our guess or anticipation is this is a great option. I think it will continue to be used, and it's not a very expensive option to allow people from across the city to across the world to participate and be a part of that funeral process.
Next question. Are there limits to where funerals can take place, like a funeral home or a place of worship or home? What if I would rather rent an event venue or have it in a park or at the beach?
All of that is perfectly acceptable. I think you just have to be mindful of when you're doing a service outside at a park or in a public area, you have to continually be mindful that that is a public area, and there will be bystanders who may be witnessing a part of that, and you can't always control what people do. But there, as long as you have those set permissions to be able to do that. If you're going to try and do a funeral service in a park, you probably want to speak to your municipality first to see if they'll even allow that. They may have some thoughts or concerns, like maybe doing it within a tent in the park or what have you. We have done funerals in such places as convention centers and arenas, and hotel halls and what have you as well. We are going to be helping a family out where a public servant, a police officer, was killed in the line of duty, and that funeral service will take in a large venue, someplace like the Rogers Centre in Toronto or BMO Field. So those types of venues are perfectly acceptable with the proper permissions to be able to do so.
Next question. I want to be buried with my pet. Is this possible? What if there is a long time between deaths, and does it change depending on cremation or burial?
There's no specific rules or laws against being buried with your pet, and that's kind of a broad question. I mean, a lot of people who have pets, namely dogs or cats, will exercise at the time of their passing to have that pet cremated. So those cremated remains can then be placed in your casket, and you can be buried with your pet in that regard. Trying to keep a pet until you die, the only way you're going to be able to do that probably would be to freeze the pet, and there could be some logistics behind that, whether you want your pet in your chest freezer where your food is, so you'd have to give that some consideration. Albeit, I did have a gentleman who kept his bird. He built a casket for his bird, and he had quite sacredly froze his bird and compartmentalized it in his freezer, and when he died, his wife brought his bird in, and we put his bird in his casket. So it was an interesting process. So yes, you can.
I want a natural burial, but I don't live in a town with a cemetery that offers that. Can I have a funeral in one place where my friends and family are, and then have my body taken to the cemetery even if it's hours away?
Oh, most definitely. It's not uncommon for us to transport to out-of-town cemeteries. So most definitely, if there's a green cemetery that you're giving any consideration to, then that is something that can be done. Naturally, you would probably have to prepare for a little more expense. Most funeral homes are going to charge traveling costs, and it's usually a couple of dollars per kilometer based on a one-way trip. So that might add a little bit to the expense of the funeral, but if it's fulfilling your needs and wishes, then that's what you have to do. So you just plan for it.
Next question. At what point does a body start decomposing? Are there time limits for when a funeral can take place if the body isn't embalmed, or a time limit for how long the body can remain at home before taken away either for a funeral, burial, or cremation?
That's a great question. The first thing that I will say is that in the province of Ontario, and if you're watching this from any other location outside of Ontario, you always want to look into your provincial or state or regional laws as to embalming. In Ontario, it is not mandatory or required for a decedent to be embalmed. So we have on many occasions just bathed and dressed and cosmetized and placed a loved one into a casket for the funeral service process. Time limit, it's difficult to say. Every individual has their own body chemistry, and often outside influences that may affect how long a body will stay without embalming could be reliant on disease, bacteria infiltration within the body, and of course the type of medicines that some persons may be on prior to death. So in some conditions, that sort of decomposition can be quite accelerated in some cases, but in most cases we can maintain remains for a couple of days, especially if those remains are maintained in a climate controlled room where temperatures are lowered, and that will slow down any natural process to the natural breakdown of a body after life has ceased.
Next question. If I really don't want a specific person coming to my funeral, can I have them barred from entry?
It's a good question, and it's happened many times in my career, and it's always one of those difficult challenges. But I have had families who have gone as far as producing a picture of the individual so that we can ask them not to be a part of the funeral process. And not all that long ago, I actually had a family who hired a security guard to stand outside the visitation room and watch for a certain individual that they were convinced was going to attend the funeral, but they did not want there. It's difficult to stop people from coming. We can only ask politely if they do show up, not to come in and to respect the family's wishes. And oftentimes in those situations, it can get sort of confrontational. So not an easy chore, but not an uncommon request either. So we have had that in the future, or in the past, I should say.
Final question. What was it like explaining your profession to your children when they were young?
Well, that was a good one. For years when the kids were really young and they didn't necessarily understand or know what I did as a profession, it wasn't uncommon for them to come to the funeral home to pick me up. At the time, we were a one-car family, so my wife would go and pick the kids up from daycare after her work, and then she would come to my place of work where I would be working until 6, and the kids would come in, and it was usually a quiet time in the funeral home, and they would run around the funeral home, play the organ when they could, or dance on the keys and what have you. But when it came around to trying to explain to them what I did, it was basically done with honesty and transparency. And I do remember one time we did have a goldfish by the name of Spot, and if my kids are watching this today, they may or may not remember that. But I kind of took them through the funeral process when Spot died. And so I went through the house and I gathered up about 3 or 4 different jewelry boxes that I could find of different colors. So I had a red velvet one and a green velvet one and a blue leather one, and I put those out and I allowed the children to pick the jewelry box. So we were going to use that jewelry box as a casket for Spot. And then I created a grave marker with a cemetery marker that we would use at the funeral home to temporarily identify a grave. And we had a little service for Spot, and we remembered him and acknowledged his presence in our life and the joy that he brought to us. And then we buried Spot in the backyard, and after he was buried, we put that cemetery marker on there with his name and the year that he was born and the year that he died. And that really helped to explain the funeral process to the children and help to identify what I did as a profession. So that was a good question.
And that's the end of our questions for our first Ask Me Anything.
Well, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing that, and I continue to be here if you have any questions in the future. Thank you all very much. Wish you well.